Hey everybody, Dr. Z here. We are on part two of Ideologies after Napoleon. We're going to be talking about socialism, communism, Marxism, and the revolutions that happen in the 19th century in Europe. So socialism is something that I think a lot of people kind of mess up on, and it's really quite simple. I want you to think about everyday working class people having the basics that they need to get through their day, right? The British call it cradle to grave, like basically the idea that you have enough food, you have your healthcare, you have your a roof over your head, you have education, sort of the basics of life are provided to you. And that's sort of the basic idea of 19th century socialism. There was a political revolution in France, of course, French Revolution. We know that the British had their Industrial Revolution. We see laissez-faire economics, making people feel like, wow, gosh, capitalism is so competitive, right? This is a moral crisis. So who's taking care of the workers? Well, the socialists. That's what they care about. So modern capitalism fomented selfish individualism that encouraged inequality and social division, right? So socialists would see the Industrial Revolution and capitalism as inherently causing the everyday lives of working class people to be worse. So socialists wanted to help the poor. They wanted to reduce the wealth gap between the rich and the poor. They thought that private property should be regulated or even abolished. And so where I think a lot of people sort of go wrong when they think about socialism, they think of it as like all or nothing, and it isn't. Socialism is actually a very kind of large umbrella of ideas that sort of manifest in different ways in different times and spaces across human history. It is the root of communism. It's embraced by the working classes, and it starts in France. So workers in France were opposing laissez-faire laws that denied their rights to organize in guilds or unions. So the sort of first socialist, or one of the first socialists, is a guy named Saint Simon. He is what is called a utopian socialist. Utopian, of course, because it's didn't really succeed. His ideas were pretty radical, right? He looked at class structure of society, and he said society was made up of people who were parasites, the court, the aristocracy, lawyers, churchmen. And then the other class of people are the doers, scientists, engineers, industrialists, and that these doers would eventually, if given power, abolish poverty and war by leading society with scientific principles. He was all about, the idea that science and engineering and in industry was going to save everybody and stop war altogether. Yeah, utopian, right? We know this certainly didn't happen. Government should plan the economy with investment banks and public works projects, promising employment for everyone, and that all of this would improve the conditions for the poor. So in other words, those who are most enlightened, okay, scientists, engineers, and industrialists, and have talent should then therefore be the ruling elite, right? So that he's arguing for smart people to be in charge. Scientists deserve power, not the clergy or property owners. And of course, coming out of France, right, with the different estates, this makes a lot of sense. Another utopian socialist and follower of Saint Simon was Charles Fourier, and he is known for his idea of a phalanx or a grand hotel. He wanted a society that was based on cooperation and concern and not rampant individualism. So he basically thought about these mathematically precise apartment buildings. They were self-sufficient communities that would house 1,620 people each. And notice it kind of looks like the Palace of Versailles. All property was to be owned by the community, okay? An Eden of joyous labor. There would be a garden city. It was an agricultural commune. That people do the work that they're best suited for, and that they would rotate jobs to maximize happiness, so that, the crappy jobs that nobody wants, like taking out the trash in the apartment building, that, that job would rotate around, and, so that everybody could share in the work. And that these networks of phalanxes would then replace the state, that a phalanx would be a small state of people. There would be 4 floors of apartments. the richest people would live on the top and the poorest people would live on the ground floor, but that means that the rich and the poor are living in the same building. So in that sense, he kind of got 19th century architecture right, but he did not, the rich and the poor generally aren't living in the same building, right? So he got that part wrong. Wealth was determined by one's job, and jobs that people didn't want would also receive higher pay, right? So if you were doing something that no one else wanted to do, right, and it was seen as worthwhile, you could get more money for it. Fourier, of course, is also very anti-Semitic. He thought the Jews should perform all the farm work in the phalansteries, that it wasn't going to be, they weren't going to have the same sort of share in all of this as everybody else. So again, utopian. As far as I know, nobody lived in these. This was just an idea. So another utopian socialist who's less utopian than Fourier and Saint-Simon is Robert Owen. And I say less utopian because he actually achieved quite a lot of what he set out to do. In Scotland, he built the new Lanark Mills. This was a cotton spinning complex. He had 2,000 employees. On this complex, not only were the mills, but there were apartments and schools and a store and gym. And he basically created what we would sort of think of as like imagine like a college campus for his workers and their children. He believed that character was formed by the effects of the environment upon the individual. So if he could make his workers happy and give them everything that they needed, like education and a place to work out and school for their kids, then they would be happier and they would be more productive. And in general, he actually found that this did work quite well. He believed that education was central to the creation of rational people. He would prohibit physical punishment of children. He restricted child labor. He believed that people were naturally good and that they can flourish when all evil is removed. He eventually traveled to the United States, to Harmony, Indiana, and established New Harmony. But his absence from there, because he had such a dynamic personality, basically they couldn't reproduce what he had in New Lanark without him actually being there. So, as we know, with certain governments and ideologies, you have, if you have a really charismatic person behind it, a lot of times their personality is the key to the success of the ideology. And so for Owen, that was certainly the case. And he thought that if he produced moral individuals, then capitalist society would move forward. And he saw that that was sort of the MO of what his work was. And that his, a lot of people look at his ideology and say it mirrors the temperance movement, the feminist movement, the abolitionist movements. Yes, he's socialist, but also has a lot of those sort of liberal ideologies built within it as well. Now on to Marxist socialism. We're going to start with Marxism. Communism is a huge umbrella like socialism, okay? And it comes out of socialism. But communism itself sees many different forms across human history. But it starts with Karl Marx. He was a Jewish journalist, a philosopher, and he wrote about the plight of the laboring poor. And he was persecuted in Prussia for his writing, and he was forced to flee. He traveled around Europe, promoting different socialisms and socialist ideas. His colleague, Friedrich Engels, is the co-author of the Communist Manifesto, but Marx kind of gets all of the attention usually for it. Published in 1848. He settled in London after the 1848 revolutions in Europe, and he wrote Capital in 1867. So the Communist Manifesto and Capital are two of his biggest works. He thought utopian socialism was too fanciful, and he saw his own socialism as scientific. And what he means by that is it's really rooted in history and law. He saw it as realistic. He looked at different patterns in history, basically that history was the story of class struggles, that it's always the haves versus the have-nots, and that, the class struggle over economic wealth was the great engine of human history. Upper classes have always exploited the lower classes, and that modern industry created larger gaps between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So he saw the bourgeoisie as a small minority of people. These are people who own the factories, the lands, the farms, right? He called everything that is in a factory and a factory itself and the land and the machines are all called the means of production. And he said these are the people who own the means of production, and that they grew rich, the bourgeoisie grew rich by exploiting the proletariat. And that over time, the proletariat would grow larger and poorer, and that their plight would lead them to develop a sense of revolutionary class consciousness. Right. So this working class would grow stronger through their struggles together, right? And that they would recognize who they were and the power that they had. Then, just as the bourgeoisie had triumphed over the aristocracy in the French Revolution, the proletariat were going to have their own revolution and overthrow the bourgeoisie in a violent coming revolution that would result in the end of class struggle and the arrival of communism and a system of radical equality. He thought this would expand all across the globe, that basically countries and nations would be abolished, that, workers would be united across the world, and that, basically, eventually workers would take over. But first, of course, capitalism, right, had to be abolished. And so, that's the basic idea behind Marxism. We're going to talk about it more in class, and of course, we'll read some documents as well. Another big ideology of this time is nationalism. So we're going to talk a lot about nationalism moving forward. Actually, we have an entire chapter coming up on nations and nationalisms, but in the 19th century. But you have to think about it, because coming out of the Congress of Vienna, those European monarchs were not thinking about nationalism. They weren't thinking about who the people wanted to be ruled by. They weren't thinking about a vision of a people united by a common language, history, culture, or geography. They were just thinking about their own traditional monarchical rule. So if we think about France, for example, in the 19th century, we learned a little bit about how French armies in the industrialized France, right, that they got together and people started to meet each other from different parts of France and started to recognize each other as Frenchmen rather than someone from Toulouse or someone from Paris. If we think about Germany, we have people who are united in defense of their fatherland against Napoleon, but also united in their sense of their national identity and a sense of their ethnicity as Germans, right? That there's a blood base to it, in the sense of, I have inherited this. And that those ideas, they seem intangible, right? What makes someone French or makes someone German? Those ideas can be advanced through conscription, right, which is the draft. It can be advanced through education, right, through learning a common language. It can be advanced through culture, songs that are, sung across pubs in Europe, and, and also through literature and even children's books, right? We learn nationalism in many different ways, sometimes obvious, sometimes a little bit more subtle. And nationalism, of course, has its limits. Peasants in nearby villages in France failed to understand each other, right? There was a large diversity of French dialects, large diversity of Italian dialects in the 19th century. A lot of times people had a hard time communicating because there wasn't a common language yet. Austrian, Russian, and Ottoman empires were multi-ethnic, right? And so were most states. And those big empires also were multi-religious, right? And so those nationalisms that creep up sometimes seem like surprising, right? Or nuanced or even small, right? Because of that. But we have to remember that these nationalisms are important, right? World War I was, the spark of it started with a Serbian nationalist, right? Who, wanted to make a statement against the Austrian Empire. Liberals tended to be nationalists. They tended to be in favor of nations and nationalisms. And nationalism itself was supported by Romanticism in the arts. Now, I'm going to pause here because we have a little bit more to talk about in this. So there's actually going to be a part 3.